this, I'm joined by TRT World's defence and political analyst, Oubai Shahbandar. So just talk us through the Russian president's partial withdrawal here. What is the significance of this? Does he believe that Russian forces have done their job and it's all over, or are there other motives here?
Well, Shuli, what we saw here was a surprise visit by Vladimir Putin to the Russian permanent air base in northern Syria, the Khmeimim air base, which is a massive military base where a significant amount of the Russian forces are positioned. He gave a rousing speech to his troops, followed by a military parade where he told his troops that their mission had essentially been more or less accomplished and they could go back to their families back in Russia, now that the fight against extremists, as Vladimir Putin calls them, has come to a conclusion. Although we have to remember that there is precedence here of Russians making troop withdrawal announcements in Syria, but not necessarily following through. We've seen prior announcements almost a year ago by the Russian Ministry of Defense of the end of combat operations in Syria and troop withdrawal, but not truly following through with it. Now, the question is, are there other motives here? Will Putin's announcement of troop withdrawals actually lead to a significant drawdown of Russian forces from Syria? What we do know is that the Russians have signed long-term military basing agreements with Bashar al-Assad that allow them to stay in Syria for a significant amount of time. In his speech to the Russian forces in the Syrian airbase, Putin did leave options open to continue the fight by saying that the Russian forces will continue to strike so-called extremists as needed. So Putin here seeming to give a mission accomplished type speech, a victory speech to his troops in Syria, just a few days after he announces the fact that he's going to seek re-election as president of Russia. So many questions still remaining after this major announcement by Vladimir Putin.
And the fight against Daesh is one thing, but propping up Bashar al-Assad's regime is another. Is Bashar al-Assad going to continue to need the help of Russian soldiers to remain in power? Well,
we saw Bashar al-Assad meeting Vladimir Putin as he stepped off his airplane in the Khmeimim air base. Clearly, Bashar al-Assad is extremely grateful to Vladimir Putin for saving his regime. In fact, we are seeing many commentary by Syrians when we were seeing the footage of Bashar al-Assad greeting Putin. Many Syrians are saying that it was it was almost humiliating that Bashar al-Assad was, kowtowing to Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin certainly seems to be in a much stronger position over Bashar al-Assad. And let's not forget that the Russians equate both the legitimate opposition to Bashar al-Assad with the extremists, so they don't really differentiate between the two. The Russian Air Force has launched airstrikes both against rebel forces and against Daesh. So when we hear Vladimir Putin declaring a victory over extremists, he's really referring to both the fight against Daesh and against legitimate rebel forces that were fighting against the Assad regime. Whether or not Assad can remain in power, can remain his hold on power without Russian forces is also extremely questionable, which leads us to believe that more than likely there will be some continued level of Russian military presence in Syria for some time to come.
Oubai, thank you. Oubai Shahbandar there in Istanbul.